Hi everyone, it's it's Ren here. Hope everyone is doing well. Um, I just had an idea or something pop into my mind in relation to INFJ writers, or maybe perhaps more generally like NIFE or FENI type writers, um, as distinguished principally from like writers who have either low FE in their stack um, or like high FI. Um, I have a little theory that I wanted to share with you and see what you guys think. It's really not super developed at this point, but I figured, I'd share it with you because it just occurred to me and it could provide a useful way of sort of like navigating those various type landscapes. Um, the idea is the following. It arose from like my experience of reading like Thomas Mann, Kafka to an extent, Dostoevsky, Hess, but also Murakami, and I suspect that there will be a fair few among you who have read Murakami because, he's a popular author, and I just happen to know a number of INFJs who read a lot of Murakami. He's a popular author. Um, Comparing those experiences, the pattern that I'm observing is this, and I can also draw a comparison with my own approach to writing, which I will do maybe a little bit later. It's that it seems to me that the more the NIFE is strong in a writer, so in other words, the more the writer is close to the INFJ archetype, but it also kind of works in the ENFJ case, as I have observed. It seems that the more the writer will be interested in exploring a lot of different characters with different personalities, including different function stacks. Like the writer might not necessarily be aware that, you know, like their characters have X function stack because they won't know about MBTI. A lot of the writers I'm talking about, were writing before Freud, before Jung, and before Myers and Briggs, certainly. Um, but if you look at the novels of Dostoevsky, and INFJ, Hermann Hesse, and INFJ, but also the novels of Victor Hugo, the French writer who's the author of Les Miserables, which I think in the US is mostly known through the various musicals that have been made of it, but also The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He's an ENFJ writer, and if you pay close attention to the worlds that Victor Hugo creates and the world that Dostoevsky and Hermann Hesse create, it's very striking that they seem interested in writing characters that have FE in their stack, no doubt. Like you'll find ISFJs, ESFJs, ENFJs, INFJs. But you also like find a lot of P types in Victor Hugo, a lot of FI dominant types, some TI dominant types. In Les Miserables, like if you're familiar with the book or with the universe, without necessarily entering into like detailed analysis of those characters, you can get a sense that there's like a prodigious variety of different, like very different characters, and so the writer is interested in like painting like a portraits of these different characters and exploring them. Dostoevsky, like you pick like a novel like you know um, like Crime and Punishment, for example. You have obviously the main character Raskolnikov is an INTJ, but you also have the girl that he ends up, the woman that he ends up with, Sonia, is FE user. You have I cannot remember her name now, but the woman, the consumptive woman, the woman who has a case of tuberculosis in her children. Maybe someone in the comments will will help me remember her name. She was a very moving woman. It's like definitely an FE dominant. So you have like Raskolnikov, who's like FI tertiary. You have an FE dominant. You have an ESTP in the character of Severgailov. You have Raskolnikov's friend, who's probably an ENFP, and I'm probably forgetting a lot of other ones. You have like Raskolnikov's sister, who's an FF user, Dunya. The guy, the ambitious sort of careerist who initially is considering proposing to her, it seems like a TE dominant. So there's an incredible variety of character types in both Victor Hugo and Dostoevsky, and we could apply the same to Hess. In Hess, it's almost like there is this fascination with writing characters that are not aligned with what they're like themselves. And again, you can sort of see how that could happen, right? Like INFJs are very interested in projecting their FE, like their NIFE outward toward like analyzing lots of different types of personalities, and you could imagine how they'd be interested in recreating them. In the case of like TI, led writers, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I'm only really familiar with Thomas Mann and Borges, the Argentinian writer, and I think that in their case, there's the focus is on world building rather than character building. They can be interested in building like interesting characters, but it doesn't seem to me that the main focus is putting all the intensity in the characters. Which is why, like, if you read Death in Venice, or if you read The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, or if you read The Book of Sands or any other collection of short stories in Borges, you don't have a lot of characters that emerge as like having a strongly defined personality types. I think it's because the concepts are always kind of overarching. So that's a way of kind of singling them out. And then in the case of a lot of writers obviously are FI led and sometimes FI dominant, the INFP writers. My impression, now it's true that potentially Shakespeare is an exception to that, so like the very name Shakespeare could be defeating my entire arguments. But let's just leave Shakespeare aside for now, right? If you consider Proust and Murakami, right? Marcel Proust and Haruki Murakami, they're both INFP writers. They're considered INFP writers. Like, I've read basically the entire, In Search of Lost Time by Proust. The vast majority of the characters that are well developed and well explored in Proust are FI users. Swann is an FI user. The Baron de Charlus is an FI user. Albertine seems to be an FI user of some kind, and Gilbert seems to be an FI user. And if they're not FI users, the TI dominates the FE. So there's not a lot of characters in Proust that are FE users, and I'm really fascinated by that because I'm observing the same thing in a lot of Murakami. Like, I've not read a lot of Murakami. I'm sort of a latecomer to Murakami, but like I'm really into his literature at the moment, and like I'm reading through the third novel, which is Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. Before that I read the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, and before that I read Kafka on the Shore. Where are the FE users? Guys, tell me, where do you see any FE user in Murakami? Like, in Kafka on the Shore, the main character is like, he's either an FI dominant or a TI dominant. So technically, if he's a TI dominant, he's an FE user, but really not a strong one. You don't see a lot of FE. The character of Sakura is an FI user. The character of the librarian boy or young man that he befriends is an FI user. Now, like, you could argue that the woman at the library, the older woman at the library, Miss Saiki, she seems to be an FE user, so that's an exception. But still, it's not a lot of characters. In the Wind-Up Chronicle, like, main characters in FI user, like, mostly FI users. And in the End of the World, the one I'm reading now, it's like I can't really see a lot of FE either, except manifested as inferior in the case of like a certain professor type character. So, like, there's not as much variety in terms of like the presentation of a cast of very varied personality types in an FI writer as opposed to an FE dominated writer, FE and IFE, as opposed to, let's say, FI and EFI, right? And it's what I'm observing, and I'm wondering what kind of conclusion to draw from this. Why are FI dominant writers very interested in FI characters, whereas FE writers are not particularly interested in FE characters. It's very interesting, isn't it? It's very interesting. Now, my preliminary my preliminary analysis suggests, or the following hypothesis, and you can offer your own, and we can discuss this in the comments, that because FE has this kind of universal tendency and of projecting itself towards the other, it doesn't really matter what the other is, because they are incarnations of a bigger picture, a bigger whole. And so the FE NI or NIFE writer is going to try to capture as much of the breadth of that universe. Whereas the FI dominant writer, I feel like their focus is probably going to try on being like able to write an authentically real, emotionally accurate character that feels accurate to them, and their template, also because they don't project FE toward the other, is probably going to be themselves. And because their template is going to be themselves, they're going to be naturally more interested in developing FI characters, and those FI characters will be incredibly profound and deep, as you can see in Search for Lost Time by Proust, for example. But there's not as much interest, it seems, in like sort of extending beyond that horizon into developing like a great ENFJ character, or a great INFJ character, or ISFJ, or the FE character is not so present because the template is lacking in the INFP writer. At least that's how I'm perceiving at the moment. So if that's the case, it could be a very useful and interesting way of start by sort of applying this and figuring out what the type of the author is, and maybe that could help us solve typings for certain authors. Let me know what you think in the comments, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday, guys. Ciao.